She's somewhere near camp, probably gathering berries, maybe tending to a child. He's out hunting. That's where they've both been for the last 100,000 years. Or so the story goes. It's in every museum, every textbook, every documentary about early humans you've ever watched. The division feels so obvious, so natural, so old that nobody thought to question it until someone looked more carefully at the bones. In 2018, a team of archaeologists were excavating a 9,000-year-old burial site high in the Andes of southern Peru. They found a grave. Inside it, 20 stone tools, 6 projectile points, cutting blades, hide-scraping implements, a complete big-game hunting kit, carefully stacked next to the body as if they'd been held in a leather pouch that had long since dissolved. Everybody was talking about how this was a great chief, recalls archaeologist Randy Haas of the University of California, Davis. A big man. Then someone looked more carefully at the bones. They were slender, light. The tooth enamel, analyzed using a technique that examines X and Y chromosome proteins, told a different story. The great chief, the big man with the hunting tool kit, was a young woman, 17 to 19 years old at the time of her death, buried with the same care and the same tools as any elite male hunter of her time. Her name in the archaeological record is Willamaya Pacha Individual 6. She is now the oldest confirmed female hunter burial in the Americas. And she is not the exception, she is the pattern. I started looking into this expecting a story about one surprising discovery. What I found instead was something larger, a systematic revision of almost everything we thought we knew about who prehistoric women were, what they did, and why we got it so wrong for so long. So I went deeper. The story most of us grew up with goes like this. In prehistory, men hunted and women gathered. Men were the providers, the risk-takers, the ones whose skills drove human evolution forward. Women stayed closer to camp, tended children, collected plants. It's a tidy story. It's also, increasingly, looking like a story we told ourselves. In April 1966, roughly 75 anthropologists gathered at the Center for Continuing Education at the University of Chicago for a 4-day symposium. The event was organized by Richard Lee and Irvin DeVore, sponsored by the Wenner Gren Foundation, and attended by some of the most influential figures in the field. Marshall Solins, Colin Turnbull, Louis Binford. They heard 28 papers, participated in over 10 hours of open debate, and produced a landmark volume that would shape the discipline for decades. They called it Man the Hunter. The book's central argument was that hunting, specifically male hunting of big game, was the primary engine of human evolution. Language, cooperation, tool use, social bonding. All of it, in this telling, flowed from the male hunt. Women were present in the theory, but peripheral, the gatherers, the ones who stayed. For 50 years, this framework dominated how scientists thought about prehistoric gender, and it turns out it was built less on what the bones said than on what the people reading the bones already believed. Here's the strange part. The bones had always been there. The tools in women's graves had always been there. What was missing wasn't the data, it was the willingness to read it without the assumption already loaded in. University of Delaware anthropologist Sarah Lacey spent years reviewing the Paleolithic skeletal record. Her conclusion, published in the journal American Anthropologist in 2023, was pointed. The idea of a strict sexual division of labor in the Paleolithic is, in her words, an assumption with little supporting evidence. What the bones actually show is that women's skeletons from this period carry the same patterns of physical stress as men's, the same joint damage, the same muscle attachment marks, consistent with the same kinds of physically demanding mobile activity. When women scholars had published contrary findings in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, their work was consistently dismissed as feminist critique rather than treated as science. It took a dead 17-year-old in the Andes to make the field stop and look again. A subsequent meta-analysis by Haas and colleagues published in Science Advances in 2020 identified 10 other female burials from the same period, 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, associated with big game hunting tools in statistical parity with male hunter burials from the same time and region, and a broader 2023 study published in PLOS1 examining 391 foraging societies from the 1800s to the present found that women hunted medium or large game in 48% of those societies. The woman who stayed home while the men hunted was not a universal. She was an assumption. Now set the statistics aside for a moment. She was somewhere between 17 and 19 when she died, at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, on the windswept Andean Altiplano. The air at that altitude is thin enough to slow you down, to make your lungs work harder, to make every movement cost more. The animals she hunted, vicuña, wild ancestors of alpacas, deer, large camelids, were fast and skittish and required stealth, endurance, and precision with a spear thrower to take down. When the excavation team uncovered her grave in 2018, the tools were stacked in a neat pile by her hip, as if they had been bundled and placed there at the moment of burial. 6 projectile points, cutting blades, hide scrapers, ochre, used for tanning leather. Initially, the team assumed they had found a high-status male. It took laboratory analysis of her tooth enamel to establish the truth. She was probably ordinary. An ordinary young woman who hunted large game in the high Andes, was buried with her tools when she died, and then waited 9,000 years to be read correctly. So if Paleolithic women hunted, gathered, and held roles far beyond what we assumed, what happened? Something did change. The question is when and why. Around 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent and independently in other parts of the world, humans began domesticating plants and animals. The shift from foraging to farming is one of the most consequential transitions in human history, and its effects on women were profound and, for the first time, measurable in the bones. Archaeological evidence from Neolithic settlements across Europe shows a clear shift. University of York researchers, analyzing over 400 stone tools from Neolithic cemetery sites in 2021, found that by this period, tools in women's graves were predominantly associated with hideworking and domestic tasks, while tools in men's graves were linked to hunting and conflict. The division that the Paleolithic record does not support had, by the Neolithic, become visible in the ground. The reasons are debated, but the pattern is consistent. Settled farming required different labor structures than mobile foraging. Larger, permanent communities generated surplus, and surplus generated hierarchy. Property began to matter. Inheritance began to matter. Many researchers argue that once inheritance became important, greater control over lineage and reproduction also became socially significant, because knowing whose child was whose determined who owned what. It's a contested explanation, but the archaeological pattern it points to is not. Economists Ola Olson and Christopher Pike, in a 2020 study published in the Journal of Economic Growth, found a striking correlation. The longer a society had practiced agriculture, the lower its contemporary measures of gender equality. The relationship held across cultures, continents, and centuries. The woman stays home narrative isn't ancient, it's agricultural. It's roughly 10,000 years old, which sounds like a long time, but represents less than 5% of the time our species has existed. Wilhelmina Pacha, Individual 6, is now in the scientific literature. Her tools are catalogued. The projectile points stacked by her hip have been confirmed through microscopic wear analysis to have been used for exactly what they look like, hunting large animals. She's been correctly identified, but she lived 9,000 years ago, before the farms, before the surplus, before the inheritance systems that would eventually reassign her descendants to a different story. She hunted because that was what her world required. She was buried with her tools because that was how her community saw her. What came after wasn't inevitable. It was a response to new conditions, and it calcified, over millennia, into something that looked permanent. The bones from before the farms tell a different story. They always did.